During the State of the Nation address, President Jacob Zuma announced that the government would embark on radical socio-economic transformation, with land and land reform being top of the agenda. Now, the question of expropriation of land also came forward in the place of failing and slow willing buyer and willing seller land reform systems in place here. The Institute of Race Relations, an independent research body, says that providing a racial breakdown of South Africa's rural landowners was almost impossible. Now, according to the Institute, currently the state owns 22% of the land in the country, including land in the former homelands. Most of the land is occupied by black subsistence farmers who have no title deeds. Now, to take this matter further, we are joined by Dr. Anthea Jeffery. She's the head of policy research from the Institute of Race Relations. A very good morning to you, Doctor. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
What would South Africa look like if land had to be expropriated without compensation?
The economic consequences would be catastrophic, because property rights are the foundation for business activity of any kind. So even if the expropriation was initially at least limited simply to commercial farmland, the insecurity that every mine owner, factory owner, retail shopping centre owner and so on would feel would be enormous. It would be impossible to attract new investment, and we would run the risk that businesses would try and cash up and get out before the axe falls. And we've seen in other countries that a threat to property rights, even if it is confined to agricultural land, has these major ramifications. We saw it in Zimbabwe, where there's now hunger and massive inflation. We see it in Venezuela, where there was a program of land reform begun about in the early 2000s, where again you have now real land hunger. You have people living in Caracas being urged to grow food on the balconies of their flats because the farms can't produce. We have inflation at 700%, and we have hunger. And, of course, very high prices for food as well as for everything else. So we need to be very wary of disrupting the property rights that are the foundation for the market economy, which is what sustains jobs and income and gives a hope of a better life to all South Africans.
Black South Africans believe that their dignity can only be restored with the land.
I would like to interrogate that. I think that the apartheid injustice was appalling, that people were barred from buying land in white areas, so-called, that there were a number of forced evictions in the 1960s in particular, when black people who had managed to buy land in the period before the 1913 Land Act were pushed out. And I thought it was important that there should be some provision for restitution. But now we must also look at what has happened in the interim. And Gugelian Quinte, the minister, has himself said that we no longer have a great mass of people who are interested in farming. We now have a very rapidly urbanizing society. We have people who would like to come to the towns and cities, who would like to have land for housing, who would like to have jobs and to be able to earn an income. We do also have some people who would like to farm. And we have organizations like the African Farmers Association of South Africa who complain that the government's approach is the wrong one. They talk about the big ideology, but they don't talk about the kind of practical help that would enable black farmers to expand, to become more successful commercial farmers, bigger operators, and that there are a whole lot of practical things that need to be done to achieve that at a low level, infrastructure like roads. But critically speaking, that they must also have ownership. And this is where there's a kind of almost a con at the heart of the government's rhetoric about land. It's saying it's going to restore land to the people. What it's actually talking about with expropriation is taking land for the government. The government ends up as the owner of that land. And it has no intention of transferring ownership to individual black people. Its policy is leasehold only. And African farmers have been saying, please, we want ownership. And this has been denied by the government. So it seems very ironic that we will end up with land nationalisation rather than real reform.
Is that not maybe the best way forward, considering what's been happening in South Africa in the last 20 years? Houses, land's been given back to people and so forth, and then out of desperation those people sell it. Should the government not hang on to the land and then lease it to people to make sure that they don't sell land to benefit immediately in the short term and rather create sustainable lives on that land?
Perhaps you need an initial short period of leasehold, But if it's too short, then it also becomes a recipe for preventing any success, because a black farmer then can't raise working capital, hasn't got collateral.
Yeah.
And so I think you need a process where you identify those who really want land, you help them to become successful commercial farmers. Perhaps you should recognize the extent of mentorship that is actually coming from the white farmers at the moment and see them as a resource to be used. And critically, you also need a growing economy. Part of the reason why people are simply selling is because they feel the difficulty of making a success of farming, which is perhaps the most difficult business of all.
Yeah.
And it's made more difficult when we have a stagnant economy.
Yeah, it's not like a job. You have to immerse yourself in the life 100%. I want to ask you about your research before we close up. You talk about it's almost impossible to get a racial breakdown of South Africa's rural landowners. Talk to us about that a little bit, and then what does that mean?
Well, we're not able to tell the racial identity of landowners at the moment, because the information was dropped from the deeds registry a number of years ago, at the time of the political transition, when we seem to be moving away from the racial tagging of people. So you would need to have a comprehensive racial audit to be able to assess just what is the current ratio. But again, the most important thing is it's interesting information, but the most important thing is to recognize those people who really want to farm and then make it possible for them to farm. Whereas if we have a massive program of land reform which empowers the state and not the ordinary people, we could also see a lot of commercial farming land falling out of production, with huge ramifications for food security and food prices, which would affect all South Africans.
In conclusion, what would you think is the best way forward? Because we need to move forward with regards to the land issue.
I think we must stop threatening expropriation without compensation. It's the worst message to send to potential investors at a time when our growth rate is already down to 0.3%, and we have an enormously high unemployment rate. Secondly, we can say that we recognize the historical injustice. We also recognize that very few people actually want land to farm. Of those who successfully reclaimed land, 92% chose cash instead of land. We should talk to organizations like the African Farmers Association and say, what do we need to do to make it easier for your members to expand into the commercial sphere? And we should have a very pragmatic and constructive program around that.
Dr. Jeffery, we've run out of time, but it's a very passionate conversation that's going to define the next decade, I would think, here in South Africa. Thank you for joining us
Thank
today.
you.
That is Dr. Anthea Jeffery. She's the head of policy research at the Institute for Race Relations here in South Africa, talking about land reform, land claims, and, of course, expropriation without compensation.